Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Casey Mukai, and on behalf of YBE, I would like to thank you all for joining us for Buddhist editorial third event in our summer event series, Face to Face, Collective Karma, Acknowledging Colonial Legacies and Living in a Post-Colonial Reality. We want to make this space as community-like as possible, so don't hesitate to use the chat box to answer, ask any questions, as well as the reactions on Zoom. If something resonates with you, we love that. A reminder that the speaker and panelist portions of this event will be recorded, but any audience members will not be. So don't be afraid to turn on your camera or join us in this virtual space. One of the most important things for us today is just to be mindful and respectful of each other. So we do have these community agreements that I will send to the chat, but also to send any to the chat of your own that you resonate with or want to include in this discussion. For those of you that are new with us here right now, welcome. The Young Buddhist editorial was started in January of 2020 by a group of young Jodo Shinshu Buddhists with the intention of creating a space and platform for young Buddhists to foster growth, community, and interconnectedness while creating a dialogue between young Buddhists and other generations of Buddhists. The Social Justice Committee of YBE was started last summer in response to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, where we hosted a series of workshops on how we can approach and talk about race in our Buddhist community. However, from there, we have grown to be so much more, holding other workshops, most recently our current face-to-face series, where in our two previous workshops thus far, we have discussed queerness and abolition. We welcome anyone who would like to get more involved. Here's our link to our website for those interested in connecting with us or checking out more of our work. I will also send just a bare schedule of today's workshop to the chat, just for anyone that needs time markers. However, just expect it to be kind of fluid, just as the space goes. But yeah. With that, I will pass it over to Tara to lead us in a land acknowledgement exercise in a moment of mindfulness.
Thank you, Casey, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Tara, I go by she, her, and as you may have seen in the chat, some people are adding in that they live on Ohlone land or maybe names that you're not as familiar with. So what this is it's a native land acknowledgement. And so those of you who have joined us before, normally we begin our event with a land acknowledgement. And today we'd like to take actually a few extra minutes to really explore kind of what that means and to really honor the land that we're on. And so a little bit of background, the native land acknowledgement is to kind of have that space to really acknowledge and be mindful that we are on land that was stolen from the indigenous people before us. And so, for example, for me, I live in the Bay Area, so I currently reside on the land that is the Ohlone people's land. So if you all would like to go to a website, we're gonna put it in the chat and the Jamboard. So native land, go to native-land.ca and you can look up what land you are currently residing on. And then once you find that, you can click over to our Jamboard and you can add in on the Jamboard where you are. So we can see where everyone's calling in from, and then really take a moment to pay our respects and acknowledge the land that we're on. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Thank you, everybody. I'm scrolling through. Does anyone need a couple more minutes? Are we good to keep going? All right. So we didn't want to share a screen just yet because sometimes it gets confusing to click on a link. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at that Jamboard. Thank you. And you can start seeing. You can either put a sticky note or you could put the text if you're still working on that. And so I see Ohlone, Lance, people are a lot of Bay Area people, some people on the East Coast. The Chesapeake and Lindsay. And just take a moment to really see all of the different places. Okay. It looks like our post-its and text are slowing down a little bit. So yeah, I encourage everyone to also, go back to the website and kind of explore a little bit about the tribes of the land that you're living on. So one more, we're gonna go now. Oh, we have a couple more still coming in. Just wanna take a moment to recognize those. And I'm sure you can see it much bigger on your own screen. All right, so thank you everyone for sharing that with us. And now we're actually going to jump to the next Jamboard slide. So if you all press one arrow over to the right, you'll be able to see all of the different tribes, all of the land that we're on, not just in the United States, but also in the surrounding countries. So we'll just take one more moment to acknowledge the land. All right. Thank you everybody for participating in this activity and for really taking a moment to slow down and acknowledge that, we're interconnected with all of these people, all the indigenous people who lived on this land before us and that it was taken from them, and really taking a moment to see that. So thank you all. I believe now I will pass the talking stick to CJ.
Thank you, Tara. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speakers for our panel today, starting with Jean-Paul R. Contreras deGuzman, or JP, as we like to call him. He uses they them pronouns. He is a teacher, a scholar, and a public historian. Dr. JP deGuzman is a comparative relational race historian. His writings on Asian American communities include Race, Power, and Politics in Trafalgar, Los Angeles, and the Interdiscipline of Asian American Studies, These writings appear in various academic and community-based venues. JP teaches at UCLA, where he earned the university's Distinguished Teaching Award. Committed to public history, he's advised the LA Office of Historic Resources, co-founded the Tunya Canyon Detention Station Coalition, serves on the Buddhist Churches of America Archives and Historic Preservation Committee, and has been interviewed on various NPR affiliates. JP is a certified minister's assistant at the San Fernando Valley Honganji Buddhist Temple. Thanks for joining us, JP. Next, I'd like to introduce Gina Mie Goosby, who uses she, her, and hers pronouns. She's a 2020 graduate of Swarthmore College, where she majored in Japanese studies with a special focus on Koreans in Japan, or Zainichi Koreans. Her family history within the Korean and African diasporas has heavily informed her academic and professional interests. Since graduating, she has founded New Sun, which is a small business that centers the work of queer, trans, Black and Indigenous people of color authors and creatives. She plans to relocate to Osaka, Japan in the fall of 2021 to pursue teaching and to engage further with the Zainichi community. Welcome, Gina. And our last speaker for the panel today is Mariko Fujimoto Rooks, who's a public health practitioner and uses she and neutral pronouns. Mariko Rooks is a Black Yonsei hailing from Tongva land known as Los Angeles, though she's currently a second-year social and behavioral sciences MPH student at the Yale School of Public Health with a concentration in U.S. health justice. She graduated from Yale College in 2021 with a double major in the history of science, medicine, and public health, and ethnicity, race, and migration. In addition to historical and contemporary work surrounding systems of oppression and health outcomes, Mariko serves as the Eastern District Council representative for the Japanese American Citizens League, National Student Youth Council, the Arts and Intersectionality Lead for BIPOC Literary and Arts Platform, Changing Women Collective, and the research project manager for USA Water Polo National Racial Equity and Reform Task Force. Mariko's written and spoken work can be found on Yale's undergraduate research journal, the Smithsonian Museum's National Youth Summit in 2016 and 2021, Discover Nikkei, Juksong at Yale, and Yo magazine. In her spare time, she also is a two-time All-American nominated Yale water polo player with a deep love for the Korean musical group BTS. Welcome, Mariko. So great to have you all here. And I think we're going to start our panel now with a brief introduction to what colonialism and decolonial thought is. So I'd like to pass it off to our speakers.
Thank you so much, CJ, for that warm welcome. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm so excited and honored that y'all have come here on a Tuesday night, even though it is Jungkook's birthday, to listen to us talk a little bit about colonial and post-colonial thought and how it applies to Buddhism. And to start off, when the three of us met to talk about this event, we thought that giving a little bit of an overview might be helpful because I think, especially on social media and in different social justice and activist spaces, we see terms like imperialism, neocolonialism, post-colonialism sort of being thrown around a lot, but not necessarily everyone knows what they mean, and it can be a little bit inaccessible in terms of language and in terms of content, when really it's something that I think the majority of us have felt and experienced, from a lived perspective. So we're going to try to do a brief overview about that. I'm just going to do some quick definitions, and then JP and Gina will address some specific things that we're going to focus on today in terms of grounding our own experiences as primarily Asian American Buddhists. So when we talk about colonialism, we are talking about you know, sort of controlled by some sort of nation state, which means a sort of governing entity that has borders and is defined by borders. And we all know that borders in general can be very complicated. And they choose to take up some sort of national outpost or sort of national expansion into a territory that is outside of those borders. And so that is sort of what we define as colonialism. And in particular, colonialism really focuses on setting up some sort of governmental and economic structure that supports the original nation state. And so this is really similar to imperialism, which is also extraterritorial, but colonialism actually can occur in a number of different ways. It doesn't necessarily even have to be sort of outside of those borders. And so I think the most common kind of colonialism that folks are familiar with is what we call exploitative or resource colonialism. And that's where, you know, you're a normally European country, not always. You see another country and they have something you want, you settle that country in order to primarily take those resources. You're not interested in necessarily inhabiting it, but whatever wood or fish or sugar or whatever it is that sounds pretty good to you, you're going to go ahead and grab it. And so the structure for economic exploitation, and often the exploitation of labor of more marginalized folks, be it indigenous or not, is the reason why that kind of colonialism is happening. We also see though surrogate colonialism, which is where there's some sort of colonial project that's supported by a power, but isn't necessarily being enacted by them. And so for those of us who are based in the US, that's pretty much what the US does all the time. If you've been following headlines about things like Afghanistan, a lot of the times the US will choose to back some sort of often phrased as pro-democracy government that is supported in another country and gives them financial support, gives them military support, gives them sort of national backing, but it's not officially the United States sort of stamp on, you know, the country in question. And the last kind of colonialism that I'm going to talk about before I turn it over to JP is internal colonialism. And this is why colonialism is different than imperialism. The idea of imperialism is that it's always extraterritorial. It's always outside of the borders of, you know, a particular state. It doesn't have to be governmental, but it's always outside of the borders. Internal colonialism, though, is something that is really strongly experienced in the US, which is the sort of concept that arose in the 1950s and 60s that, you know, not everywhere in the US is the same. And so particularly when we talk about neighborhoods that are referred to sort of more colloquially ghetto neighborhoods or like very impoverished neighborhoods for reasons that are often intersecting race and class, that area is often colonized using the same methods that you'll see for resources, for people, outside of our country's borders as well. And so for folks in California, if anyone's following what's going on in Inglewood with the gentrification of, you know, the nearby area to do all the NFL work, but also the ways in which people are systemically barred from leaving that area and from accessing resources, or even things, you know, like healthy food or equitable healthcare. So you find like these internal colonies within the nation state where conditions are very different and people are being subjugated. And so that's sort of what we see there. The general history of colonialism is that, you know, it starts in the 17 and 1800s. It goes through around World War II, where sort of Japan, as also a colonial power, starts pushing people out. The sort of various changing world conditions that are happening in the 40s and 50s allow for a lot of countries to declare independence, colonized countries. And they'll have things like the Bandung Conference in 1955. I'll drop a link in the chat, but really momentous occasion for African and Asian countries that used to be colonized to come together, declare independence, and decide what that means. And so that's sort of why we refer to post-1950s as, you know, post-colonial. However, and this is the last point that I'll make, even though a lot of folks are sort of legislatively or in the realm of the nation state, you know, free countries, we still see a lot of this sort of force-dependent relationships and the marginalization that was happening during colonialism in many different places today, again, including inside the US, but also, you know, nationally and internationally. We're seeing a lot of that. Another good example is Haiti, right? If folks have been following what's going on in the news there, the reason why Haiti is in the position it's in is because of like this, even though they declared their independence, they were required to pay back millions and millions of dollars in like debt to former colonizers. And that sort of has really, their economy still struggles because of that and because of a lot of sort of successive things and policies there. And so that's called neocolonialism. It's a little more snaky, right? It's not official jurisdiction, but it still enacts a lot of the same forms of marginalization that, you know, really prevent things from being equitable today. So yes, and hopefully that was not too much at once. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, but I'm gonna turn it over to JP to talk a little bit about one specific type of colonialism that I didn't just cover.
Thank you, Mariko, for that very comprehensive overview, and thank you all for joining us today. So whether you have your camera on, whether you have your camera off, this is my teacher voice. Give me a digital thumbs up if this resonates with you. How many of you remember the story in high school? Maybe you took AP US history. You had a textbook with a ridiculous title like America's Story or The American Pageant. And American history was basically told by the vantage point of the Pilgrims. They arrived Plymouth Rock. Everything was great. At some point, we got sick and tired of British colonialism, and we said, no more. And somehow we became an independent country. And I see many of you are lighting up the screen right now. So thank you for that. So that story, right, which is still taught in schools today, hides a different type of colonialism that I would argue we all participate in, and that's called settler colonialism. And that's something that I find so interesting because it helps us understand the paradoxes of how people can both be oppressed and oppressors. And I think about that in relation to Asian Americans a lot. So settler colonialism is a type of colonialism where basically immigrants as settlers displace native people. And it's a very uncomfortable truth, particularly if we might have friends and loved ones in Hawaii, where, as we know, the majority population is Asian American. And what's so fascinating to me about this concept of settler colonialism, where in many ways there is not a cavalry, there is not an artillery, there is not dropping of bombs to pacify people, but just the lived everyday experience of people coming into a land and pushing the indigenous people off, right? That's a very insidious story. And it's really tough for us too, because again, we're the beneficiaries of that. And I always tell my students, right, I never want us to like malign, right, like the hard work that our ancestors may have put through. I don't want us to disparage or denigrate the racism and the oppression that perhaps our ancestors and loved ones who toiled in the plantations of Hawaii faced. But when we only tell that story, we ignore, we forget, we erase the people whose land that was. And when we focus on a story of racism, and oftentimes a story of resistance against that racism, again, what we forget are the people who may have endured, who may have borne the slings and arrows of so much prejudice. They too, we too, are part of that larger structure of the dispossession of land. And so I'm excited for our presentation, our conversation today, to think about, well, how do we grapple with that? How do we understand our own histories with that? So thank you so much, everyone. And Gina, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, JP and Mariko. And again, thank you everybody so much for joining us this evening. Yeah, so I mean, just like a point, I did not grow up going to like a Buddhist temple and having like a Buddhist community around me. I also grew up thinking I was Japanese, which is not true. My mother is a third generation Korean immigrant to Japan, and her grandparents, my great grandparents, were forced to come over due to the imperial aspirations of the Japanese Empire at the time during like the World War II era. So I'm very familiar with, as I've grown older and asked my mother and my relatives about their history growing up there, of the colonialist, imperialist side of Japan. So I'm rather new to this community, and I have a lot of love for Japanese culture. I'm bilingual, like, you know, I do consider myself culturally very Japanese, but I'm also just sort of here to provide, I guess, another perspective of somebody who has sort of lived Buddhist philosophy without the, I suppose, like the, what is like the word? I grew up Catholic, so I like the scripture, but I'm so sorry, my language is bad today. But without like the entire like Buddhist structure around it, but still with that mindset of, you know, putting others first and seeing yourself as part of a larger community. In addition to sort of pulling back into a more like global mindset of this, because I think as people who live in the United States, most of us are very familiar with thinking within our frame, but especially having seen not only the imperialist powers, colonial powers of the United States, but also those of Japan. There's always, I think, more than two sides to every story. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, speakers, so much for grounding our conversation with really a comprehensive and really insightful history and concepts, and sharing some of your own lived experiences. That was really wonderful to hear. There's also a lot of context for folks listening. I know right now my mind is racing and I'm grappling with all these concepts. So I'd like us to take a moment right now to return to the Jamboard and just take a second to reflect on what our speakers have so wonderfully outlined for us. Any questions that you have that are lingering, any feelings or thoughts or reflections that are coming up, go ahead and feel free to add them to the Jamboard. So it looks like folks are dropping in their thoughts. Really happy to see the Zainichi community represented and to learn more about all the intersections presented today. Yes, agreed, very much. Thank you, Gina, for sharing your experience, and we look forward to hearing more about it in this next portion. RE settler colonialism. How do we reconcile the fact that some who occupy unceded land did not come here of their own volition, i.e. through indentured servitude and enslavement? Very good question. That is slightly above my pay grade. Another question is, how do we understand these concepts through a specifically Buddhist lens? Great question, great event to be. We'll hope to touch on that in the coming discussion. Colonialism is so complex. I think I'm just coming to understand how much in knowledge I do lack about the concept, but how vital it is for me to be here and learn this. 100%. I think I'm also learning too, and I hope that the rest of this event can be a learning experience for everyone. Should we discuss how the legacy of colonialism has impacted historically Buddhist lands and how that has impacted the legacy of those regions today? Very good question. Again, hopefully we can answer that in the remaining time. I'll just read a couple more responses. Outside of professional context, how does the topic of colonialism come up, and how do you talk about it with others? Can you give an example? Very good question. And would any of us be Buddhist without colonialization or colonization? One more point, I echo Dr. JP's point that the feelings are so complicated with the situation of immigrants and settler colonialism. Yes, indeed. looks like things are slowing down a bit, but these are wonderful thoughts, wonderful questions, really deep and complex questions as well that I think, let's go ahead and yeah, another great one. Conversely, are there folks who have experience with Buddhism as a means of decolonization? Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, let's hop right in. The first question we have lined up for our speakers is what are your thoughts on karma in Buddhism, history, and post-colonial thought, and just general feelings of the intersection of all of your work and experience with Buddhist teachings and yeah, your experience.
I think I can go ahead and start things off here, and I think I can also try to address, you know, in talking about my own experience, some of the questions that are in the Jamboard as well. You know, I think when we talk about karma from a Buddhist perspective, not really the sort of like white appropriated eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth version of karma, which is actually very, very Christian and also very carceral. But instead, the sort of understanding that sort of karma, right, is really about the causes and conditions that bring you into the place that you are today, right? Right. So what is sort of your burden to bear because you're there, and you know, good karma, bad karma, it all is sort of just what happens to you and a little bit about the context as to why it happens. And so I think, you know, when we talk about ourselves and how we move through the world, understanding that, you know, we are all shouldering because of these larger systems and structures that extend far beyond, you know, the lives that we're currently living now, different but intersecting and related karmas when it comes to topics of colonialism and oppression and, you know, those legacies extending into the present, even right as the sort of formal colonialism period has ended. And so I think, you know, for me as someone who's Black and Japanese, it's a really sort of interesting thing to wrestle with, particularly given the ways in which these two communities are often pitted against each other, you know, within an American frame. But in terms of settler colonialism, you know, the question about reconciling unceded land and, you know, versus coming here of your own volition, I think that actually has been a really helpful way for me, at least, to reconcile those parts of my own identity, because, you know, one of the most profound things I had ever heard in an Indigenous history class was that, you know, when it comes to Black folks who were brought here, like my ancestors, you know, forcibly, the idea that those folks are displaced Indigenous people, right? And so what does it mean, right, when you make that move and when you start considering yourself that way? Because yeah, as someone who is generationally Black, right, we have no idea where we come from. Like that history of what it means to be tied to a homeland in that way has been really wiped away for us. But it also does mean that we have specific kinds of stake, particularly given the ways in which Black folks were forced to work Indigenous land in the sort of project of settler colonialism here, with what Black and Indigenous allyship looks like, especially because the ties between the Indigenous and Black communities through sort of shared systems of oppression are really long and deep. And so when it comes to sort of talking about land back, when it comes to sort of talking about reclamation, that I found has been, you know, the most helpful and also most heartening way to go about it when we're working with Indigenous folks, you know, in community and in solidarity. And then also the idea that, like, you know, there are immigrants and that there are migrants, and that migrants are often part of like a forced migration, as opposed to immigrants who sort of choose to come here of their own free will. When we talk about servitude and we talk about indenture, particularly in Asian American histories, being able to really connect those histories to Black communities and to sort of what that does to the settler colonial project actually does a good deal of work in, you know, deconstructing that oppositionality between the model minority and sort of like, you know, other communities of color. And so recognizing that, you know, folks were brought over here under similar contexts for similar purposes, particularly in the Caribbean, I think for me has helped me sort of understand that, like, when you have that kind of shared history, you have a shared investment in each other's liberation because you're being brought here by the same larger systems. And that's sort of like a burden and, you know, sometimes a joy, but certainly a karma that like folks share of various identities that I have.
To build off of what Mariko said, you know, and particularly making it very personal and in the context of Buddhism, you know, particularly in Jodo Shinshu, we talk so much about gratitude. If you go to the BCA website, the Buddhist Churches of America website, the slogan is a life of gratitude. And I think that sometimes we lose sight of, you know, how do we push that even further than just expressing gratitude for all that we have? Because awareness of the benefit of the compassion that we receive from all life, you know, involves a very careful examination of our own privilege. You know, why is it I am grateful that I can enjoy a meal, a very nice meal? Is it because of the money in my pocket? Is it because I may not look like, and I am not racialized as a threat in the way other people of color are? And so I think that, you know, looking at, you know, taking it one step further by thinking about what am I grateful for and how did that come to be really speaks to Mariko's point and can help us, you know, just develop that greater mindfulness.
I think these are all like amazing points. And interestingly enough, actually, Mariko, I think that your point sort of gave me a way to verbalize something that I've always kind of felt, which is that, well, sort of secondhand personal experience. But my mother, when she was like a kid in like middle school, I think, in her library in her school in Japan, she found like a book, like a photo essay book by this Japanese photographer who took candid photos in Harlem. And she read like Native Son and, you know, not like great literature, but also books that did speak to the oppression of Black folks and like chattel slavery in America, and just the system of settler colonialism that pushed out Indigenous people and enslaved Indigenous folks and African people. And she was so struck by the continuity of oppression from, you know, the 1500s up to the present day for Black folks. And it like shook her. She was like, wow, I experienced the same thing, except I can choose whether or not this happens to me by saying my Korean name, because otherwise people don't know. Black people can't like turn it off. And so because of that, she gained a very like deep sense of connection almost, and seeing like, oh, like other people are oppressed the way that I am, but not the way that I am. And so that was something that she taught me very early on, is like, you like don't know what sort of, you know, oppression other people have endured or what other people's ancestors have endured. And you never know the ways in which their struggle may resonate with yours. And so in that way, like take your experiences as a Black person, you know, and the way that you want to uplift those around you, and like bring that sort of mindset to all people who have ever been, you know, oppressed, even if they don't look like you. Like everybody is struggling with something. So that's like, wow, my brain just kind of exploded a little bit. But yes, absolutely. And I think something that I heard in one of my, at the temple the other day, was the idea of cultivating good karma, even for those that we dislike, or even people who have passed on that we disliked. And the idea that by cultivating good karma, like in ourselves and for our immediate community, it resonates, you know. And so again, having shared stake in each other's liberation, as all of us are, you know, victims of this colonial system that continues to go on because we are divided. Like that's definitely, I think, something to think about.
Thank you for all of your answers. Echoing Gina's point, my head is exploding too right now. Such insightful answers. And I think picking up a little bit more on this point of Buddhism, let's kind of drill down into how is your maybe interaction and experience living the Buddhist teachings, whether formally or informally, intersect with colonialism, where either through lived experience or as you studied it, and perhaps maybe some of the ways in which your experience as a Buddhist has kind of created friction between the two. I'd be very interested to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you know, really interesting because Buddhism, in a lot of ways, when we talk about like just sort of how Buddhism pitches, like this is how the world works, the like, right, the things that resonate with us, a lot of that is just inherently anti-colonial when you talk about it from a really like
Oh, it seems we might have lost Mariko for a sec. In the middle of a really thoughtful sentence too. I think. Yeah, I think perhaps would another speaker like to pick up, and then we can return to Mariko. Mariko's thoughts when she rejoins us.
So Juliet, thank you for reminding me. We're on the question about, those intersections between Buddhism and colonialism and post-colonial thought. So I'll just say, again, a very personal answer. Much like Gina, I was raised Catholic because my family is Filipino. And because of 300 years of Spanish colonialism in the Philippines, Catholicism is embedded in Filipinx culture. And so for me, in many ways, I think that having a Buddhist identity is in many ways an anti-colonial act, just from my own perspective. And I think that it has actually caused some friction because people question my own identity because of that colonized mentality that link being Filipino, Filipina, Filipinx with one particular religious experience.
Yeah, this is actually really interesting. So raised Catholic, very messy. And interestingly enough, so I go to a temple now, but because I'm in Virginia Beach, which is Virginia Beach, we have a Vietnamese temple because there's a large Vietnamese population here. And so I was able to go to LA and visit one of the Japanese Buddhist temples there, the Senshin Temple, which was different. I went to one of their online Zoom services and everything was very different. And in a way, because I understood some things in Japanese, I felt this kind of makes sense. But at the same time, my local temple, I've sort of established this community there as well. But again, it is very strange to sort of reflect on those colonial legacies. I, as somebody with Japanese and Korean heritage, am going to a Vietnamese Buddhist temple, which also holds Vietnamese cultural celebrations. So it's again, it feels very we're all here for the same, at its root, not great reason, but we've all found this collective community together. And they do a lot of amazing mutual aid stuff. They have people from the local community will come together and do food drives. They'll have fresh hot food on certain days, lots of cultural celebrations, like I mentioned. And so I don't know, it's honestly a privilege for me to be in that space. I will partake in as much as, it's appropriate. But again, yes, the ways in which not just Buddhist practice, but also Buddhist community are very anti-colonial and provide that space for marginalized people of various different identities to connect and to mobilize is very, very incredible.
Definitely. Yeah, and it was cool to have you at Senshin also as a Senshin member. But also, I'm so sorry. Our internet has been real tough today, so I apologize for cutting out in the middle, but hello, I am back. And, I think to just build off of those points, when we talk about sort of Buddhism as an anti-colonial identity, colonialism is sort of really driven by these ideas of hierarchy and separation, right? Countries are separate from each other, colonies feed up to the mother country. All of this needs to be permanent and sustainable and to make you even greater than you were before, but not really in super helpful ways and not really in ways that are necessarily great for everything around you, right? There's a lot of war because of people fighting over colonies and fighting over that kind of stuff. And that really plays out into sort of every aspect of life. And so I think for me, actually, where it came up the most was academically. I was at Yale as an undergrad, which meant that the high school process of getting into Yale was really, really intense. And it was very much about sort of ranking people against each other and, you know, what scores you're getting, and everything was sort of measured and quantified and sort of drilled out. And of course, then it doesn't even matter, right? Because it's going to be who reads your essays and stuff like that. But one of the things I was really struck by is that there is like a Buddhist high school in Hawaii. And I just remember reading about what they were doing and thinking like, wow, using Buddhism as like a way of sort of grounding how you learn and how you teach and how you interact with people is completely different. Like, for example, in their sports, and like I was also like a recruited athlete, the goal of that school is to tie every single match. It's not to win. And so like that alone, I think would have changed like my experience greatly with like, right, everything that I was doing. And like the way that their sort of classes worked was very similar, right? When we talk about sort of discipline and punishment, like those sort of pedagogies weren't really embedded in that. And so I think, while it's not to say that like Buddhism hasn't been leveraged in a lot of different ways in the past, but it gives us sort of new opportunities and new ways of seeing in the world that are less sort of rooted in what we take for granted and much more rooted in sort of what JP is talking about, right? This sense of gratitude and this sense of connection and engagement with others that isn't sort of qualified by those forms of hierarchy.
Oh, I just wanted to add, sorry, like one more point also. This is something that I encountered rather recently that's still kind of percolating in my brain. But somebody pointed out that at least like in the West, or like particularly America, a lot of media has like a very, very subtly like Christian theme of forgiveness, and the idea that like in order to like redeem yourself or to be the hero, like you claw your way back to the forgiveness or absolution of others, rather than, you know, finding some sort of like either like a more worldly like, I don't know, like a more like general, more neutral, like moral stance, or like a general path of righteousness, and more like achieving forgiveness from a certain person or from society, and reaching this level of satisfaction as deemed by others. And so I think that is like a very, very Abrahamic, very Christian sort of ideal, the idea that others determine your salvation rather than the idea of providing for others, not for, you know, recognition from them, but for knowing that like you're cultivating this good karma. So that was just a comment I wanted to make.
Yeah, thank you so much. I found the point of thinking about how competition is inherently colonial, and the way we conduct our interpersonal relationships, and even how we prioritize salvation of the self and within others as another form, kind of subtle form of colonialism, to be very interesting. I think the point about Mariko's talk, I think revisiting geographically the land of Hawaii and realizing that we have this Buddhist high school, I think the only of its kind, I believe, on this land with a very complex history. I think JP had brought it up earlier, in which most of Hawaii right now, the population is Asian American, and how for a lot of folks, especially in the audience who are Asian American, who may have family history in Hawaii. I know I personally have family history in Hawaii through my great grandfather was a farmer, and being able to say, well, he immigrated slightly under duress to this land, but he was only able to immigrate to this land because of the project of colonialism and the forcible annexation of Hawaii. And so I think that's a really interesting geographic point to talk about if we want to pick up there, and maybe spend some time thinking about diaspora, especially Asian American diaspora and displacement in terms of colonialism, and perhaps how we can either begin to investigate, unravel, and reconcile our histories in this way. I think I'll clarify the question because I feel like I kind of weaved it into a response. But could you all share a little bit more on your thoughts on displacement and diaspora? I think I was particularly struck by Mariko's point about how Black Americans who were brought here forcibly under enslavement were themselves displaced indigenous peoples. And maybe what are your thoughts perhaps on, I think as JP hinted at earlier, reconciling that maybe very personal history of colonialism and immigration?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely very tough to reckon with in a lot of different ways. I think a lot of sort of what we talk about in terms of diaspora, which is just where you're like from one place you move to another place, just sort of definitionally, is the idea of sort of, right, there's the place you move to and then there's your homeland, but that homeland can be real or imagined. And so what the homeland means and what the homeland is carry a lot of different kinds of weight. And that can be really complicated by things like settler colonialism and, you know, not necessarily having a home that is yours. And so I think that, you know, for me personally, being Yonsei, especially on my mom's side, sort of what Japan means and like what Japan is very different than folks who are sort of what we call Shin Ise or Shin Nisei. And maybe Gina, you can talk a little bit more towards this as someone who's like adjacent to that, because, you know, like we pretty much don't have any family in Japan, right? My great grandparents were the ones who migrated. You know, for our family, at least, like Japanese as a language was pretty wiped out in terms of fluent speaking by incarceration during World War II. And so while I've grown up very culturally Japanese American, I think some of the things or the stakes that like I have in Japan as a place that I visit and as a place that I like form connection with my identity, especially as a mixed person, especially as a mixed Black person, are, you know, very, very different than other folks that I've met that are part of the same diaspora, for all of those reasons that are, of course, very rooted in the colonial structures we're talking about.
Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely as Shin Nisei, my experience is a little different, although I would say my experience with Korea / my vision of Korea is also rather similar. Because of, you know, the colonial project, we don't know where my family is from in Korea. And like most Black, you know, African Americans or Americans of African descent, I don't know where my family is from in Africa either. So just sort of like floating in the void here, which rocks. But yeah, the idea that you know, Korea is, you know, this like homeland or motherland honestly never really struck me, even once I learned that I was really Korean and really leaned into learning about it. Because my mom, when she was about my age, she went to Korea as like a sightseeing trip and to have fun. And she was with a friend who spoke Korean. They got in a taxi and the taxi person was like, "Oh, where are you going? Are you tourists?" And she said, "Oh, well, like, you know, we're both Korean." And the taxi driver said, "Well, your friend doesn't speak Korean, so she's not like really Korean." My mom was like, I wasn't taken to Japan on purpose. I was just born there. And, you know, I sort of grew up hearing that. I know, big boo, big boo. So I've never really identified as like Korean because I'm like, well, I'm not. So why would I front? Like thank you everyone. We appreciate it. And so, you know, in the same vein, I never really had huge motherland, like homeland feelings towards either Japanese or Japan, because imperial everything. And also I didn't grow up speaking the language, even though I do now. Korea, because I'm just so far removed. And so when I actually did my thesis on this book by a Zainichi author, whose main character goes to Korea for study abroad and basically has a mental breakdown because she finds in so many ways that despite her claim to Koreanness, she's being gatekept at every step of the way. And she's, you know, placing a lot of that burden for being gatekept on herself. And while perhaps the author was not intending to, you know, frame it in the way of like, this is what the colonial project does. It was like, this is the experience. This is what happens. Not only when, you know, people gatekeep us, but when we, you know, take on that burden without really thinking deeply about what our positionality is and why we're here and how much of it really isn't our fault. So yeah, displacement and diaspora, I think, are very, very complicated because there are great things that can come of it, amazing communities that can form because we've been forced out of where we were supposed to live, where we're from. But at the same time, wherever, people are being displaced and going somewhere else, like that land was not theirs to begin with. And so there's always sort of having to balance the idea that we're benefiting from the colonial project, even if, it doesn't feel like it at the time. So I guess all this to say, colonialism is really, really messy, and diaspora makes it messier, but somehow we make it work.
To kind of connect this discussion about diaspora, its messiness, and colonization and conquest with kind of a discussion we had earlier, which is about how, thinking about karma in many ways provides a template for the solidarity politics so many of us want to see now, makes me think of one of my favorite chapters in both Asian American and African American history. Some of you might be familiar with this, but as we know, Reconstruction, that period of time after the Civil War, was a period of immense radical potential, right? The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the Freedom Amendments that abolished slavery, gave African American men the right to vote, and created citizenship for African Americans, was cut short by just brutal racism and the disavowal of civil rights by whites. And so one of the few avenues for many African Americans to pursue their hard-fought freedom was military service in the United States. And if we remember US history, that coincided with the Plains Wars. So what a profound irony, but also a profound example of how white supremacy works, that the avenue for freedom for African Americans was to fight against indigenous people of the plains. And to connect it to my own history, many of those soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, were sent to the Philippines to conquer the Philippine Islands in the late 19th century. But and this is just so powerful for me, so many of those soldiers deserted. They rejected the United States Army. They saw in the Filipinos a insurgent revolutionary people that they saw in themselves. They bristled at the fact that America used the same language, the same corrosive racist language to describe Filipinos, and African Americans helped fight for Philippine independence. And I think that's so powerful. And again, is such a wonderful story of Black Asian solidarity. And when we throw colonization and diaspora into that, what is the effect? You have generations of Filipinos who, in their American schools, American set-up schools, in their lives here in the United States, adopt anti-Blackness because that story of the Buffalo Soldiers is not told. And so again, it's just messy and complex to see how all these histories intersect. And I think that, again, to mention something I brought up earlier, that's why these histories, whether it is Zainichi Koreans, whether it is African Americans in the Philippines, those histories offer such a glimpse of possibility.
Yeah, echoing what Eli Rin has put in the chat, I didn't know the story, the Buffalo Soldier story, and yeah, how powerful that potential for solidarity and the stories of solidarity too, not even just the potential, but that those stories can power and motivate solidarity movements today. Amazing. The best parts of history, I think, get left out for many reasons we've discussed. I think I would like to pick up on a conversation some folks were having a little earlier on the chat, in the chat rather, of how pardon me as I try to find it. As we were talking about the sort of legacies of patriarchy, of hierarchy, and of, in many ways, colonialism that exist in many of our sanghas. And I think we have spoken to the merits of using Buddhist teachings and to reframe a colonial mindset and way of life. But maybe we can touch upon and bring that conversation, kind of uplift that conversation, and comment on some of the ways we don't see this, and we see this, that despite we have so many anti-colonial teachings, in reality that might not be the case. So I'd like to open that up to the speakers for any comments. If you want to echo what you said or add on to what someone else has said in the chat too. I just thought that was a wonderful conversation that should be elevated.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you so much to everyone's contributions within the chat. And yeah, I definitely don't intend to misspeak about sort of, right, I think a lot of our experiences in the temple system, like myself included, right, don't always necessarily mirror the pedagogies that we're talking about. And that, yeah, as again, as a Black person, as a non-binary person, as a woman presenting person, definitely all of these things I think resonate for sure. I mean, when we talk about things like even division of labor at most, right, like big J temple events, right, it's very, very gendered. When we talk about and it's actually been a really sticky and interesting and messy conversation in a lot of youth programming about the way in which things are gendered and the way in which heteronormativity is socialized in things like dances and different social events, even when we talk about sleepaway camp and how all of that happens. Certainly there is, I think, a lot we need to work on in Japan itself as a country as well. But I think one of the interesting things about Buddhism, though, is because you do have actually sort of a really interesting sort of theological and pedagogical standpoint of, right, Amida doesn't have a gender, we don't talk about that, right? What does that mean? Or in general, the ways in which gender and the ideas of gender are sort of really pushed and the boundaries are pushed, Thai Buddhism in particular, right, associates sort of Buddha and Buddhism and Shakyamuni also with sort of ideals of transness, or at least of, right, defying gender presentation. So I think that there's a lot of history there, and a lot of the reckoning is sort of with uncovering, like JP was just talking about, the histories that are excluded to make sure that certain people stay in power, which is a pretty good example of, I think, ego that we wrestle with and ego that is allowed to play out, within a very hierarchical space. What does that look like? And, what does that end up being?
If I could just jump in and pick up on that point, Mariko, about talking about Amida Buddha really is not having a gender, and yet the way we've translated both the teachings and the literal language that we talk about, a lot of the teachings as well, and a lot of the readings that we do, in particularly the Jodo Shinshu tradition, how that has been very much gendered as a result possibly of colonial influences in translation, in transporting of concepts and stuff. Definitely resonate with that. Okay, I think, can everyone still hear me? Okay, thank you. I think with that, thank you all the speakers for your insights, and I would like to open it up to some Q&As from the audience. If we could turn our attention to the Jamboard as well, the final page, we can open it up to reflections, lingering questions, and so forth.
For sharing your experience, and it sounds like you're wrestling with a lot right now, so I'm glad that you felt this space was a space to talk about it. I don't think as an actual college student I can give you a ton of answers, but I think it's interesting that sort of the move that you're making or you're interested in making is separation, right? Of sort of separating the Buddha Dharma as teaching from the implementation of the Buddha Dharma, right, by humans who are very limited in a lot of different ways, right? Because I think one of the most interesting things about Buddhism, at least, and also I want to sort of also foreground this with the fact that we're from a number of different sects. So Jodo Shinshu reincarnation is less of a thing that we talk about and less of a thing that we believe in. So when it comes to specific theologies, I don't know if I can offer, conclusions to every point simply because, different sect, same religion. But I think that when we sort of talk about that element of separation or sort of how do we do that, I think, Buddhism often reminds us that while things need to change sometimes, that separation is not it often can teach us a lot to, instead of examining sort of how they're separated, right? How and in what ways, are they connected, or do they go together, or do, sort of, when we talk about, right, cause and causation and, interdependence, right? Sort of, where is that lineage coming from? And then what can that sort of teach us about the world and about ourselves and about, and about ego and about sort of self and selflessness. Again, this is sort of, I think, a very specific sect of Jodo Shinshu and a specific sort of teaching within that. I definitely come from Senshin. I definitely Masaku Dani was definitely our sensei, right? When I was growing up. But sort of that being sort of more of the focus, or the way that I would sort of take it, rather than seeking to sort of cut things as being very binary, or as sort of being more separated. But yeah, JP, Gina, I don't know, or really anyone, if folks have thoughts on this, because this is obviously not, a super simple issue by any means. And of course, if we had the solutions to that, we'd be, the world would be an A-okay place, I think, so.
I just wanted to pick up on something that Beatrice mentioned in the chat, which is really good. Quote, "It is possible to recognize how you benefit from these violent systems and the behaviors they've reproduced while hoping/fighting for something better for yourself and others." And I think that's kind of pretty much the way that I reconcile those sorts of things whenever I come up with them. It's sort of there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, no matter what you buy, no matter what you get, no matter how organic and how nice it is, you can go back enough steps and see somebody being oppressed on the line. But I think what is just the way to eliminate the most suffering from your life, as that I've found, is to sort of control the controllables, so to speak, and just figure out okay, so this is the legacy that this comes from. I can't change that, it sucks. But what can I do to make sure that this legacy is not forgotten and is not paved over? And so, whether that involves raising awareness to others who are within your Buddhist community, or if that's, maybe pulling back from it and really thinking on how you want to engage with Buddhism from that point on. Again, as somebody who's very new to Buddhist practice, it's take my advice with like a few shakers full of salt. But, being sure not to, ignore what is outside of your purview of control, so to speak, but being sure to acknowledge that like you shouldn't do nothing about it, but you should also acknowledge like how much you can feasibly do without, exhausting yourself or trying to travel through time. So.
A comment to kind of bridge Devin's really perceptive comment in the chat about needing to wrestle with the past. A point Mariko brought up in the chat earlier about, really trying to get at the distilled, deepest level understanding that, within our own capacities, makes me actually think a lot about a book in progressive Catholic thought by a feminist theologian named Rosemary Radford Reuter, who wrote a famous book with a very direct title, Catholic Doesn't Equal the Vatican. And that was so revelatory for me. And I think that indeed, 30 minutes ago, I said, for me, being Buddhist is an anti-colonial act. Oh yeah, and Japan brutally conquered the Philippines during World War II, and the state apparatus of Jodo Shinshu completely supported that, right? And so I think for me, and I'm not trying to give a shameless plug, but that's why I'm a part of this organization, because I know that I cannot have many of these conversations with people in my Sangha yet, growth mindset, but this space gives me the opportunities to learn, to be vulnerable, to do all those things, to create certain changes grounded in a certain Buddhist practice that may help me go back to my own Sangha to have those conversations.
Yes, thank you, Selena, for that question. And thank you to the speakers for all of your wonderful input. I think I'd like to open it now for any of your concluding thoughts, completely unprompted, anything you want to leave us with before we move on to the wrapping up this event, which has been a wonderful, wonderful event. So I open the floor. All right. Another big thank you to our speakers for taking the time this evening and coming to just speaking pure wisdom and insight at this whole event. And to kind of wrap it up, I'd like to hand it off to my good friend CJ to close us out.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you speakers, you're fabulous, and I feel like we all learned so much together, and I really appreciate everyone who came. All the questions in chat, I think this is the most lively chat that we've had for any of these events, so it's really wonderful. We have a lot to take home. Just really grateful for all of that. I think that's all. That's all for us. Casey, did you want to wrap up the event with any final announcements from YBE?
Yeah, sure. I'd just like to reiterate our deepest gratitude to all the panelists, Julia as our moderator, CJ and Tara for working so hard on planning this, and then also our wonderful audience members. Thank you so much for participating and for sharing so much of yourself and your thoughts. We will be sending out just a resource document with some of the things that were maybe mentioned in the chat or during this discussion, as well as we will have a recording of this event up on our YouTube channel shortly. If you missed anything or would like to share it with anyone who didn't get a chance to make it today. But that would be it on the logistical end. We will be having the last event